It might seem necessary at the outset to say more about the method of this movement, that is, of science. But its notion is already to be found in what has been said, and its proper exposition belongs to logic, or rather is logic, for the method is nothing but the structure set forth in its pure essentiality. We should realize, however, that the system of ideas concerning philosophical method is yet another set of current beliefs that belongs to a bygone culture. If this comment sounds boastful or revolutionary, and I am far from adopting such a tone, it should be noted that current opinion itself has already come to view the scientific regime bequeathed by mathematics as quite old-fashioned, with its explanations, divisions, axioms, sets of theorems, its proofs, principles, deductions, and conclusions from them. Even if its unfitness is not clearly understood, little or no use is any longer made of it, and though not actually condemned outright, no one likes it very much. And we should be sufficiently prejudiced in favor of what is excellent to suppose that it will be put to use and will find acceptance. But it is not difficult to see that the way of asserting a proposition, adducing reasons for it, and in the same way refuting its opposite by reasons, is not the form in which truth can appear. Truth is its own self-movement, whereas the method just described is the mode of cognition that remains external to the material. Hence, it is peculiar to mathematics and must be left to that science, which, as we have noted, has for its principle the relation of magnitude, a relationship alien to the notion, and for its material dead space in the equally lifeless numerical unit. This method, too, in a looser form that is more blended with the arbitrary and accidental, may retain its place as in conversation or in a piece of historical instruction designed rather to satisfy curiosity than to produce knowledge, which is about what a preface amounts to. In ordinary life, consciousness has for its content items of information, experiences, concrete objects of sense, thoughts, basic principles. Anything will do as a content, as long as it is ready to hand or is accepted as a fixed and stable being or essence. Sometimes consciousness follows where this leads, sometimes it breaks the chain and deals arbitrarily with its content, behaving as if it were determining and manipulating it from the outside. It refers the content back to some certainty or other, even if only to the sensation of the moment, and conviction is satisfied when a familiar resting place is reached. We come now in section 48, finally, to the very end of Hegel's long and quite involved criticisms of mathematical cognition. And he's wrapping these things up. He's made a lot of criticisms so far, and you can see them in the previous discussions in the videos pertaining to the earlier sections. Here he begins this paragraph by highlighting the connection between what are going to become two of his major works, or sets of works. There's actually two Hegelian logics. There's the Science of Logic and then the Encyclopedia Logic. Science of Logic is following pretty close after the Phenomenology, and the Encyclopedia Logic will come a bit later. Now, what he says is that there's an intrinsic connection between the type of work that he's doing in the Phenomenology and the type of work that's going to be demanded in a logic. So let's look at what he says. He says, it might seem necessary to say more about the method of this movement, that is, the method of science, but its notion is already to be found in what has been said. You notice I don't have that word notion up here because it's been involved in both of those, Begriff. Its notion is already to be found in what has been said, and its proper exposition belongs to logic. So if we wanted to create something like a synoptic, almost textbook-like, although there's a little bit of trouble doing that with Hegelian dialectics, overview of everything where you can see where everything fits in, then you want a logic. You're looking at the method, you're looking at the structure of everything. On the other hand, if we're supposed to be participating in something more dynamic, more explicitly dynamic, which is intrinsically occurring through time, then we want what we're looking at right now, the phenomenology, which is about consciousness. Remember, we've talked about all these shapes of consciousness and the development over time, the process of self-movement, self-othering, relating oneself to another. All these sorts of things fit into a progress that occurs in time, and you have to go along for the ride. I'm getting a lot of questions, by the way, about people getting stuck on one paragraph, one part of the preface. It's very important to remember that Hegel is telling you in the preface, this is a preface. It's not supposed to be the entire work. He said that from the very beginning. You're going to have to actually go through the entire work to see how all the movements fit in together. And there's a lot of things that probably won't make sense for the first-time reader of Hegel, or even second, third time, until you go through the whole phenomenology, or at least partway through it, and you see how things fit in. Certainly far past the preface. So there's a connection between structure, or presentation, and you might say the narrative, or the history, or just the story of consciousness and its development. So he says, the method is nothing but the structure set forth in its pure essentiality. And then he pauses, and he's going back to the discussion of mathematical cognition. And here he's going to distinguish what we could call the mathematical form, the way of putting things in this mode of presentation, the logical presentation, and as well as the content, the matter, what it is that mathematics deals in. And both of these are going to turn out to be inadequate. Before we actually go into that, I want to stress something, since we are talking about development. So Hegel is criticizing something that is particularly modern. As a matter of fact, you can say that one of the central features of the early modern age was this reliance on mathematics, seeing that all the progress that was going on in mathematics might be able to provide a model for how to organize the development of our thinking. And there were some advances that took place. Here's where Hegel is, in a certain respect, if not postmodern, at least late modern. He's saying, that's all great, but you can't mathematize everything. And the way in which this is being worked out, say, for example, in the great Cartesian Spinoza, if you ever look at his ethics, he's using a very geometric mode of presentation. So is Hobbes, actually, in some of his works for that matter. That was the way to do it back then. And it wasn't just a fashion, it wasn't just a style. It was seen as being more rigorous, as the way to actually organize and structure content so that you could make sense of it. So, this was progress to go from earlier ways of organizing things. Think, for example, Hegel would probably be willing to say, think, for example, of scholastic theology, and think about, some of the great thinkers in it, for example, Thomas Aquinas, and the way the Summa Theologia is ordered. And now think about early modern philosophy and how at least some of that is ordered. Some of the great pinnacles of early modern philosophy aren't actually organized in that way. For example, Descartes' Meditations. But, Spinoza is, Hobbes is. People were quite enamored of this idea of, look, we can understand everything after the fashion of mathematics, after the fashion of geometry. I think there's still a lot of that going on today. The problem is, that's not the final formulation. That's not where philosophy, or more broadly science, Wissenschaft, systematic knowledge that is able to take account of the very fact of its own generation, its ongoing development, that doesn't fit well into this kind of framework. This framework can be quite powerful, but the problem is it's static. It can't truly develop. And Hegel gives a lot of, examples of the old-fashioned way of doing this sort of thing. Explanations, divisions, axioms, sets of theorems. I forgot theorems up there. Proofs, principles, deductions, and conclusions. These are all things that you will find in the way in which philosophy was being presented. And you could say, is the presentation the same thing as the actual development, the working out of it? And here's where you get to a really interesting point. You can speak of a logic of organization and a logic of discovery, and they often don't map onto each other, because discovery itself is a process that may in fact turn out to be necessary in the end. Hegel thinks that it is. But there seem to be all sorts of contingent steps along the way where, human choice can enter, and initiative plays a role. And it doesn't have to go this way. It could also go this way. And, you have to chart all those sorts of things out. When you rely on framing things along the lines of mathematical models, or mathematoid novels, let me say, because they're not really mathematical, they're just sort of borrowing its framework, you may in fact be restricting your understanding of the subject matter that you're trying to grapple with. And Hegel is making that sort of criticism at a number of points. So I'm going to look in a moment at some of the criticisms that he's making, but another thing I want to point out here is that he also talks about the matter or the content of mathematics, and he says, why is that not suitable for handling philosophy, for handling science, writ large, for handling truth? Well, because what does mathematics deal in? It deals in magnitude, which is a relation, but it's a lifeless relation, and it's the most abstract that you can get. So he says it's a relationship alien to the notion, alien to the development of conceptual knowledge. And what does it deal in? Number, or the numerical unit, and dead space. Now, we've already encountered this, like I said in an earlier video, in terms of some of the discussions that are going to show up in the science of logic, in terms of other categories that pertain to mathematics, continuity, the ability to pick something out, discreteness. Here he's thinking of it in terms of the numerical unit and space, which is carried out in terms of dimensions, but has nothing determinate about it. So now let's actually look at what he's saying. We could put it over here if we wanted to, I suppose, and I may in fact do that with a few of these. He says, first off, when it comes to this way of presenting things, it's old-fashioned. Now, that's not to say that we should reject it just because it's old-fashioned, because we don't want to just be a bunch of philosophy fops or something along those lines. What made it old-fashioned? Well, he tells us. Even if its unfitness is not clearly understood, little or no use is any longer made of it. And though not actually condemned outright, no one likes it very much. People have worked with it, and they figured out what you can do with it, and for a lot of purposes it's not particularly useful, and people kind of have a sense of that, and so they're doing other things that don't really fit this model. And here we're talking about the development of German idealism and the great ferment in philosophy that's taking place, not only in idealism, but also in other thinkers of the late 18th and early 19th century. Hegel's saying, look, this was the way to go back in the time of the early 1600s all the way through the mid 1700s. But that really isn't the way to go anymore. People have started to get a vague sense of this. Now that by itself, maybe those people are wrong. So let's look at the more substantive criticism. He says, Truth is its own self-movement, whereas the method just described in the mode of cognition that remains is the mode of cognition that remains external to the material. So the big problem here is how can truth be articulated? That's, the question of logic again. How can truth be articulated when part of the nature of truth is that it's actually reflexive? It is self-moving. It's not just something static that you can leave there and then organize into, a nice handy taxonomy or something like that. We need some sort of way of presenting things, way of thinking things. It could even just be watching what happens and paying close attention. That can be adequate to this facet of truth that we've come to realize, that Hegel sees as absolutely central. We can't have something that's external to it. We need to enter into the internality of truth. We need to realize that we are ourselves wrapped up in this process. This is a view from the outside, from above, from a sort of pretended transcendent perspective. And that's why it actually doesn't enter into the material that it's supposed to be grasping. History, human choice, passion, the development of reason, all these sorts of things. So that's a much more important criticism. So he says, this mode is peculiar to mathematics and must be left to that science. This is fine for doing mathematics. It's not fine for doing history. It's not fine for doing, say, moral philosophy. It's not fine for speculating about the absolute. It's not going to get us where we need to go. So now he says a few other things that I want to focus on, and so we got to do a little bit of erasure here. He's changing topic slightly in this passage. He's now gone through and gotten rid of the pretensions of mathematical cognition to do more than what it is actually designed to do. Now he says, the method to an looser form, more blended with the arbitrary and accidental, may retain its place, as in conversation. So, what goes on in casual conversation? Do we demand that it actually measure up to the rigor that's required in a scientific presentation? Some people do, but those people are kind of bores and jerks. They don't understand how conversation works. Hegel is really making the point throughout this entire paragraph that each mode of articulation or presentation, within its own limits, within its own objects, it's doing what it ought to do. It's just not adequate to philosophy. So we have conversation or historical instruction. And you needn't think necessarily about a book of history. Think about the work that a docent does. You go into a museum, there's somebody there who presumably is well versed in the topic, and they can tell you a bit more about it than the placard does, or your app does. And if you actually know something about the topic, you can ask them questions, you can get involved in a conversation, but you don't expect it to be a completely rigorous, systematic, exhaustive discussion of the subject material, because it's not that kind of thing. So he says, these are designed to satisfy curiosity rather than to produce knowledge. And he says something very interesting here. That's what a preface amounts to. So everything that we've been doing so far is not the real thing. We're still on our way there. And so he says, in ordinary life, so we're also looking at ordinary life, the relationships that we have with everybody else, our eating, our drinking, our, sometimes philosophizing, when what we mean by philosophizing is thinking random thoughts and stringing them together. He says, ordinary life, consciousness has for its content items of information, experiences, concrete objects of thought, objects of sense, thought, basic principles. Anything will do as a content, so long as it's ready to hand. Ordinary life deals with the ready to hand, what's available. Doesn't mean that it has to be necessarily available right off the bat, but it's available in the sense that you don't have to do an awful lot of work to get there, and other people can also have that available, so you can have a conversation. You can actually have the same experience, and then you can start extrapolating from that. He also says, or it's accepted as a fixed or stable being or essence. So it also depends on what's already accepted. You know, for instance, in America, depending on whether you're in a red state or a blue state, there's all sorts of assumptions, and depending on where you are in the red state or blue state, there's all sorts of things that you can sort of take for granted. If you're at a union meeting, you can take for granted that the people in the union think that unions are a great thing and that anybody who wants to bust a union is bad. If you're at, other places, you can take for granted that unions are not a good thing and that they're actually causing all sorts of trouble. These are the sorts of things that ordinary life pieces together, the people that are involved in them, and have conversations about. It's not yet philosophy. It's not at the level of science. So he says, sometimes consciousness follows where this leads. Sometimes it breaks the chain and deals arbitrarily with its content. Why can it break the chain and deal arbitrarily with its content? Because there's no actual necessity to these things. The mere fact that something is accepted as a dogma in certain areas doesn't mean that it's true, doesn't mean that it's adequate, doesn't mean that we actually should accept it. The mere fact that we have some things ready to hand. Think about, for example, when you get angry with somebody. Now suddenly all the past things that they've done are, easily coming to light in your mind. That doesn't mean that you should actually think about those things or assemble them together into some indictment of the person. We're able to take these things on, or we're able to sort of sit back and critique them. What happens? He says, it refers the content back to some certainty or another, even if only to the sensation of the moment. Conviction is satisfied when a familiar resting place is reached. So what he's talking about here, as he reaches the end of this passage, is where ordinary consciousness goes wrong. Now, why is he finishing up that way? Because we might be tempted to say, well, we go away from mathematical cognition, which was the model previously for what counted as really rigorous, what counted as really philosophical, and maybe we just go back to our ordinary life or something like that, because if we lose mathematical rigor, then maybe we're rejecting rigor in general, and we need something a little bit more loosey-goosey, as we say. Hegel's saying, no, that's not going to cut it. As a matter of fact, people are doing that all the time, but they're not thereby doing philosophy. But we have already pointed out that once the necessity of the notion has banished the slipshod style of conversational discussion, and along with it the pedantry and pomposity of science, they are not to be replaced by the non-method of presentiment and inspiration, or by the arbitrariness of prophetic utterance, both of which despise not only scientific pomposity, but scientific procedure of all kinds. Section 49 is in some ways an afterthought. We're not going to spend very much time on it at all. It's one of the shortest passages in this preface, but there are a few points that are worth dwelling on. So he talks about the necessity of the notion. That's an important phrase. There is intrinsic to any sort of scientific and dialectical approach to things, there has to be some sort of necessity at work. Now, we don't have a full grasp yet on how that necessity actually functions. It's clear that it's not the same thing as necessity in deductive logic, in formal logic, as people are used to. It's got to be something that can encompass that, but also include an awful lot more, so that we can even extend necessity to things that appear to be contingent. since history is going to be a major part of this. And the way that we're going to do that is through developing conceptual, that is, begriffliche knowledge. Think about, begreifen as meaning to grasp, to take in as a whole. That's what's involved in this concept or notion that he's talking about there. And in a way, it's a misnomer to say the notion, because we're talking about a whole bunch of notions that are gradually assembled into larger and larger wholes. He says that it banishes two different things. It banishes the non-rigorous style of conversation, the actual terminology here, slipshod. We just talked about this. In ordinary conversation, we don't hold people to the same standard, unless we're kind of pedants, as we would in some sort of philosophical, rigorous, scientific exposition. You might say the same thing about, some of the funny YouTube comments you see on some things, where you're like, man, it's a YouTube video and it's about a joke. You don't have to make a big production of it. But there is that. Any sort of rigorous treatment of something like history or morality can't just base itself on ordinary consciousness, as Hegel calls it. At the same time, he says it does away with the scientific, and here he doesn't mean scientific in the full sense, he means that which prides itself as being scientific, pedantry and pomposity. Pomposity, when we have that word, somebody's pompous, they're using language with excessive formality. They're trying to sort of elevate themselves, or elevate their subject higher than it really deserves, and they do so by using elevated language. Pedantry is when you are treating every occasion as an opportunity to lecture people as if they were school children. So, Hegel's saying, it's not just we need to find a balance, we need to actually find something that's higher than these and can take both of these in and allow them their proper places. He's not saying let's not have any conversation. He's not saying, hey, nobody should do any science anymore. He's just saying that's not what philosophy itself is going to do. So then the question is, all right, so what is it going to do? How should it work? And we've talked about this before. One of the candidates that people were proposing was, well, let's appeal to intuition. Hey, man, there's some sort of like world ground that you can't really conceptualize, but you can feel, you can get in touch with, and that's what will build philosophy on. You got to have a intuition of the whole. You gotta get to some higher form of knowledge that isn't really, discursive. There's a lot of ways to frame this sort of thing. Hegel's once again saying that's not where we're going to go. He complains about prophetic utterance, presentiment, and inspiration. And he's saying, look, we don't want that. We're not going to replace slipshod ordinary conversation or science that can't really be scientific because of its own sort of pitfalls with just an appeal to intuition, because anybody can have an intuition. Anybody can claim inspiration. There's no actual necessity to that can be shared by people back and forth if they're willing to put in the work. It's just, you just open the doors of your mind or pick whatever lingo you like for it. Hegel's rejecting that. And he's been rejecting that, wholesale the entire time. Why? He says that sort of thing despises not only scientific pomposity, it's right to despise that, but it rejects scientific procedure of all kinds, meaning it can't provide an adequate account of itself, of its own development, its own relations to other things. And that's really what's going on in this passage.